My name is Grace, and I am 45 years old. I'm a stay-at-home mom with a daughter in high school. 2 months ago, I finally signed the divorce papers, ending a marriage that lasted nearly 20 years. To an outsider, it might look like I'm throwing away a stable family, but they don't know the truth. I wasn't just leaving a husband. I was escaping a monster who spent 2 decades pretending to be a devoted partner. My story actually begins over 20 years ago. Back then, I lived with my parents. My dad was a taxi driver, and my mother worked at a local grocery store. We were a very happy, close-knit family. Everything changed in a single night. That evening, I was working late at the office. Around 8 p.m., my phone started ringing off the hook. It was my mother. When I finally picked up, her voice was frantic and broken. I knew instantly that something terrible had happened. I rushed out of the office as fast as I could. When I got home, I was hit with the news that shattered my world. My father had been killed in a car accident while driving his taxi. My mother and I were completely destroyed by the shock. After the funeral, the house felt empty and suffocating. I tried to keep going to work, but I felt hollow inside. About 3 days later, I met the man who would eventually become my husband. After work one day, I stopped by a quiet coffee shop I liked. I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts, but he came up and started a conversation. Over the next few weeks, I kept running into him at that same shop. Because I was still grieving the loss of my father, his kindness and attention made it easy for me to open up. He was a great listener and was always there when I needed someone to talk to. What gave me even more of a connection to him was that he was also a taxi driver. Eventually, he began to pursue me. It wasn't easy for him because I wasn't ready for any big changes in my life at the time, but he was incredibly patient. After almost 2 years of knowing each other, we got married. Back then, I truly believed I had found the one. Our marriage lasted 18 years. I stayed home to take care of the house and raise our daughter while he went to work. We didn't have many big fights, and while we weren't incredibly close, we had a stable life. Everything changed in March 2024. While I was cleaning out the back of my husband's closet, I accidentally found an old wallet tucked away in a corner. I recognized it immediately. It was the wallet I had bought for my father with my very first paycheck. After my father's accident, that wallet had gone missing. I opened it up. Inside was a photo of me when I was 20 years old. I immediately called my mother to ask if she had given it to him, but she insisted she had never seen it since the accident. She was just as shocked as I was that it was in our house. I decided not to confront my husband right away. That night, while he was fast asleep, I crept out of bed and checked his phone. I found a message thread with an old coworker of his. One sentence jumped out at me. "You finally married the woman you always wanted." I sat there frozen for a long time, staring at the man lying next to me. A deep sense of suspicion began to grow. The next morning, I called that coworker. I lied and told him I already knew everything to pressure him into telling the truth. After hesitating for a while, he finally started talking. Before he ever met me, my husband and my father worked for the same taxi company. My father used to show off the wallet with my photo to his coworkers. My husband saw that photo and became obsessed with me. He tried to get close to me back then, but my father found out and blocked him. My father didn't trust him and thought he was a bad person. Because of this, a major grudge formed between them. Since they worked at the same company, they actually shared the same taxi and split driving shifts. During the shift right before my father's fatal accident, my husband had intentionally sabotaged the car's tires. The car failed while my father was on the road, leading to the high-speed crash that killed him. After hearing this, I lost all control. That night, I confronted my husband. I held up the wallet and repeated everything I had learned. At first, he tried to deny it, but then he broke down and confessed. He insisted he never meant to kill my father. He just wanted to get back at him and didn't realize the crash would be that bad. I didn't care if he didn't mean to or didn't realize. The fact was that my father was dead, and it started with his hand. His explanations meant nothing to me. I wanted to go to the police, but the accident happened so long ago. I had no physical evidence other than a confession and a story from a coworker. I knew the chances of a legal conviction were very low. I decided to get a divorce. The choice wasn't hard, but it felt incredibly heavy. I didn't see him as a husband anymore. I saw him as a 20-year mistake. I moved out with my daughter and cut off all contact with him. But the feeling of being unsafe never truly went away. Last week, nearly 2 years after the divorce, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a copy of that same photo of me from when I was 20. On the back, someone had written, "I will always find a way to have you." I sat in silence for a long time after reading it. I didn't feel the rage I felt before. Instead, I felt a very clear, cold fear. I realized that this story isn't actually over yet. This story happened 10 years ago. I am telling it as someone who lived through it all, but even now, I'm not sure I fully understand everything that took place. Back then, I was in high school, and my younger sister, Lily, was only in elementary school. To anyone who didn't know better, she seemed like a well-behaved child and a good student. But I always felt like something was very wrong with Lily. The first person to suffer because of her was Aunt Kate, my mother's sister. Aunt Kate had been blind since birth and lived with our family for a long time. She was very gentle, never complained, and always tried to be independent. But Lily saw Aunt Kate's disability as a form of entertainment. It started with sarcastic comments. Then, Lily began mimicking the way Aunt Kate felt her way around the house, with excitement. The pranks grew more cruel. Lily would intentionally leave objects in the hallway to make Aunt Kate trip. Once, I watched her stick her foot out just as Aunt Kate walked by. When our parents rushed in to help, Lily immediately acted like she was worried and innocent. It made me sick to my stomach, but at the time, I just thought she was being a bratty kid. Then, I started seeing much scarier things. There were always stray cats, small birds, and insects around our house. I noticed these animals appearing with strange injuries or tied up with string. Slowly, their numbers began to dwindle. One day, I went into Lily's room to get my headphones back and found a box hidden in her desk drawer. Inside were the remains of several small animals, insects pinned down, baby mice that had been cut open, and birds with their wings clipped. They were arranged like scientific specimens. I kept looking and found a notebook. In it, Lily wrote about a classmate with pure hatred. She wrote that she wanted to teach that girl a painful lesson and listed detailed ways to do it. I was stunned and truly terrified. I thought about telling my parents, but I stayed silent because I knew exactly what would happen if I spoke up. Lily always put on a sweet, fragile face in front of them. Meanwhile, I was the disappointment because I got into fights and had bad grades. Once before, when I tried to tell them Lily was hurting a stray cat in the yard, they didn't even listen. They immediately accused me of lying to get her in trouble. From that moment on, I knew my parents didn't trust me at all, so I kept my mouth shut. Everything began to change when Lily's eyesight suddenly started to fail. My parents took her to the doctor, who said it was partly genetics and partly because she spent too much time playing video games. The doctor recommended she wear glasses. Lily had a total meltdown. She used to make fun of kids who wore glasses, so there was no way she would wear them. She demanded contact lenses instead. My family was struggling financially. The cost of the lenses and the cleaning solution was a huge burden for my parents. Surprisingly, Uncle Robert, a distant relative on my dad's side, offered to pay for everything. This felt strange to me. Uncle Robert lived alone, wasn't wealthy himself, and our families weren't close. But because Lily kept begging, my parents accepted Uncle Robert's help. As soon as she started using the contact lenses, Lily had problems. She constantly complained that her eyes burned as if they were on fire from the inside. Her eyes were always red and watery, and she had to squint all the time. My parents thought she just wasn't used to them yet, so they encouraged her to keep wearing them. Lily refused to stop. To her, The physical pain was better than the embarrassment of wearing glasses. Then, her condition took a turn for the worse. In less than 2 months, the doctor delivered devastating news. Lily's corneas were severely damaged and could not be repaired. She went completely blind before the school year ended. My parents and Lily were absolutely crushed. After she lost her sight, Lily changed completely. She became quiet and withdrawn. She stopped bullying Aunt Kate. Sometimes, I even saw her sitting quietly by my aunt's side, just listening to her talk. At the same time, the animals around the house stopped getting hurt. They stopped disappearing. The backyard went back to normal. Everything seemed fine again. Until one day, I happened to walk past Uncle Robert's house. Behind his house is a garden where he used to feed stray cats and birds. That day, I noticed his trash can wasn't fully closed. Inside were several empty boxes of the same contact lenses Lily used. Right next to them were empty bottles of bleach. I stared at those items, and a chilling realization washed over me. Lily used to sneak into that garden all the time. I remembered seeing one of his cats badly injured, with cuts that didn't look like an accident. I remembered Lily throwing rocks at the bird nests behind his fence. I especially remembered Uncle Robert standing in his yard for a long time, staring at his garden with a dark, serious expression. I started to wonder, what if he had seen what Lily did to the animals he loved? If he had, then his offer to pay for her contacts wasn't an act of kindness at all. I thought about telling my parents, but once again, I changed my mind. I knew they still wouldn't believe me. And, if I'm being honest, a small, shameful part of me felt like she got what she deserved. To this day, I don't know if I made the right choice. I give half of my monthly paycheck to help my parents take care of Lily and Aunt Kate. I feel like it's my responsibility. I don't know for sure what Uncle Robert did, or if it was all just a coincidence. I have never told a soul about what I saw in that trash can, or the dark suspicions I carry in my heart. Lily had a total meltdown. She used to make fun of kids who wore glasses, so there was no way she would wear them. She demanded contact lenses instead.
My name is Dennis. This story begins last March when my father passed away suddenly. The cause of death was determined to be natural, just a result of his age. My parents divorced when my sister and I were very young. After the split, my dad moved far away and buried himself in his career, eventually climbing to a high-ranking position at a major accounting firm. For years, we only saw him occasionally on weekends for awkward dinners. A month after the funeral, once the inheritance paperwork was finished, my mom called to ask if I wanted to keep a few boxes of his belongings. I said yes. Even though we weren't close, he was still my father. A few days later, 3 large cardboard boxes arrived at my house. They sat gathering dust in my living room for almost a week before I finally cut the tape. Inside was a museum of the 70s and 80s, Topps baseball cards, an old but valuable Fender Stratocaster guitar, and expensive tailored shirts. The last item that caught my eyes was a dark brown, vintage leather briefcase. It smelled like old leather and dust. When I checked a small secret compartment behind the lining, I found a few faded restaurant receipts, some old Italian lira banknotes, and a yellowed envelope with no recipient name, only the word honey written on it. At first I smiled, thinking I had found a romantic memory of my parents, but when I opened it, my heart sank. Inside were several nude Polaroid photos of a young woman. One look was enough to tell me it definitely wasn't my mother. I read the attached letter. The handwriting was elegant but rushed. This wasn't a typical love letter. It was a cold ultimatum. This woman was sick of being his mistress in the shadows. She threatened that if my father didn't get a divorce and go public with their relationship by Friday, she would go to my mother's house in person and send evidence of his financial fraud at the company to the board of directors. I won't let you ruin my life and then just walk away. Choose your family, your career, or me. The letter was written in early 1992, a time when my parents' marriage was still technically happy. I realized the bitterness that this was likely the real knife that killed my family. Curiosity made it impossible for me to stop. At the bottom of the letter was the initial S. I took that name and combined it with my dad's old company name and keywords like accounting and HR. The results that popped up weren't the company website, but old news articles about a specific incident. A female employee at that firm had mysteriously disappeared in 1992. When I opened one of the articles and saw the photo of the missing woman, I nearly fell off my chair. That face, those eyes, they perfectly matched the woman in the nude photos I was holding. She had vanished at the exact time that letter was written. I knew I needed more information, and that's when I called my mother. I have a very specific question, and I need you to answer me directly without asking why. I gave her the timeline of the disappearance and asked if my father had acted strangely during that period. Mom didn't answer right away. I thought she just didn't want to talk about him. But a few days later, she called back and said she had remembered some things after thinking about it for a long time. She told me that right around that time, my father became a completely different person. He was constantly stressed, suffered from insomnia, and barely ate. At the time, she thought he was just having major problems at the office. Then, my father told her the company was organizing a mandatory 3 to 4 day hiking trip to help employees de-stress. But when he returned, things were even worse. He slept almost all day, became distant, and stayed in a dark mood for weeks. That was the beginning of the end of their marriage. My father never went back to being the man he was before, and about a year later, my mother filed for divorce. When I decided to tell my mother everything I had discovered, she was so horrified that she broke down. The thought that she had shared a bed with a potential murderer made her physically sick on the spot. The next morning, I did something I never thought I would do in my life. I went to the police station to report my own deceased father. I handed over the leather briefcase, the love letter, and the nude photos, the only physical evidence connecting him to a woman who vanished 30 years ago. The police took the file with hesitant expressions. They called me only once to verify a few details, and after that, there was a haunting silence. They told me the case was too old. The suspect, if there was one, was dead, and the evidence I provided was purely circumstantial. My father had never been officially listed as a suspect. The silence of the law hasn't brought us any peace. Now, my mother lives in a state of constant terror. She constantly wonders if, for that entire year after the incident, she was living with a man who could have been a killer. As for me, I look at the guitar my father left behind and feel disgusted. I wonder if the money used to buy it was the price he paid to soothe his own conscience. My biggest fear in life isn't the dark or death. It's that one day, my phone will ring. On the other end will be a detective announcing that they found that woman's remains in the very place where my father went hiking all those years ago. And the killer was my father.
There are secrets that time can't erase, especially what I witnessed during spring break in 2006 in West Palm Beach, Florida. My family had a yearly tradition of driving south to visit my uncle. His neighborhood was a perfect place for retirement, quiet, sunny, and filled with lush green trees. In my memory, previous trips were always full of laughter because the next-door neighbor, Robert, was a friendly old man. He used to teach my brother and me card games and tell witty jokes. Robert was practically part of our family. However, in 2006, Robert moved away. A man named Buff replaced him. That name was the start of a long string of sleepless nights. The moment my family pulled up to my uncle's house, I saw Buff standing in his garage. He was staring intensely at our car. My parents politely waved, and Buff waved back, but his face remained completely expressionless. Buff was a very tall man, over 6 feet, with a large and slightly overweight frame. You could tell he was quite muscular, though, like an aging former bodybuilder. His blank stare combined with that physique made anyone feel uncomfortable after just a few seconds of looking at him. On the third day of the trip, I was tossing a ball in the yard when I felt a chill down my spine. I realized I was being watched. Buff was standing behind his front window curtain, peeling back a tiny slit just wide enough for his eyes to peer through at me. When I looked back, he didn't even flinch or look away. I turned away immediately, but that feeling of being watched stuck with me for the rest of the afternoon. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I started hearing strange noises coming from Buff's house. First, it was the sound of metal scraping against metal, followed by a heavy, dry cough. Occasionally, there were faint yelping sounds, like those of a small animal. Those noises lasted a long time. It wasn't just for a few minutes. It went on until 3 a.m. This happened for several nights in a row. I told the adults about it. My uncle just said that Buff was a very private person. He didn't participate in community events and rarely spoke to neighbors. But since Buff had never caused trouble or bothered anyone, no one in the neighborhood paid him much mind. My parents strictly warned me not to bother the neighbor. They told me to avoid making a bad impression on the people around us. I nodded, but deep down, I knew Buff was very strange. Then my cousin came over to visit. I told him about Buff, and I felt a huge sense of relief because he actually took my story seriously. Finally, I had an ally. That afternoon, we saw Buff drive away from his house. Curiosity quickly overthrew our fear. We snuck over to his place and peeked through the windows. What we saw made us both freeze. The house was completely empty. There was no furniture at all. In the middle of the living room sat a large wood saw. Plastic tarps were hanging everywhere, acting like makeshift curtains or shields. We looked into another room where the floor was covered in plywood sheets, and near the back door, several shovels were propped against the wall. The house had changed completely since Robert lived there. It looked more like a bizarre workshop than a home. Just as we turned to leave, we both jumped out of our skins. Buff was standing right behind us. It wasn't clear when he had returned. Buff blocked our path, stared at us, and asked in a deep, soulless voice, "What are you doing on my property?" My heart was hammering. I stammered a lie, saying we were looking for a ball that had rolled over there. Buff stared at us for a few seconds. Then, he stepped aside slightly. We walked fast toward my uncle's house, and I gripped my cousin's sleeve tight. But right then, Buff spoke again. His voice was cold and full of hidden meaning. "Stop standing at the east window. You won't see anything. If you come back, you're going to regret it." Shaking, I pulled my cousin's arm and we ran for our lives. My bedroom was on the east side of my uncle's house, and my window looked directly into his. Buff had known I was watching him for a long time. On the last night of the trip, my fear turned into a total obsession. My cousin and I decided we had to find the truth. We asked my parents to let us swap bedrooms, claiming we needed a bigger bed. In reality, we wanted a better view of Buff's back door. Around 2 a.m., the lights in Buff's house flickered on. Through the window, we saw Buff standing with his back to us. He was holding a handsaw, moving it in a steady, rhythmic motion. On the floor, right at his feet, was a shape that looked exactly like a human body. It was stiff and motionless, like a mannequin, but it had long blonde hair on its head. I saw Buff press the saw down hard. The crunching sound of metal cutting through something solid echoed through the silent night. I went numb. My body felt like it was made of ice. My heart was thumping so loud I could hear it in my ears, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't tell if it was a plastic figure or a real body that had gone stiff. My cousin and I stayed awake almost the whole night. We lay silently in bed, neither of us saying a word. The next morning, as my family loaded the car to leave, Buff was standing in his driveway. He smiled and waved goodbye, a slow, mechanical wave, as if nothing had ever happened. I looked at his huge hands and felt sick to my stomach remembering the night before. Luckily, we never had to go back to that house. My uncle eventually moved to a different area 35 miles away. I never saw the man named Buff again. To this day, nearly 20 years later, the same question haunts me every night. Was Buff just an eccentric guy with a creepy hobby of making mannequins? Or did we actually witness a killer calmly disposing of evidence right in front of his neighbors? My name is Dean, and I'm half Japanese, half American. Even though I grew up in Seattle, my soul always craves the authentic flavors of my mother's home, especially ramen. That is why I have been a regular at a small, hidden ramen shop tucked away on a quiet street for the past 2 years. The shop is managed by Mark, a polite 52-year-old man with a professional look, and Daniel, a quiet 21-year-old college student who helps run the place. However, there was one thing about this shop that always felt off to me. It was table 4. Every day, at exactly 6 p.m., Daniel would bring out a hot bowl of ramen and a glass of water, set them down neatly, and leave them there until the shop closed. Absolutely no customers were allowed to sit in that spot. One evening, when the shop was quiet, my curiosity got the best of me. I asked Daniel about the ramen and the table. The young man lightly touched an old bracelet on his wrist and shook his head. To be honest, I don't really know the reason. It's a strict requirement from Mark, the manager. Determined to find the truth, I asked Mark about it. At first, Mark was silent for a long time. Finally, he pulled up a chair across from me and asked, "Do you believe that spirits can return to places they knew?" I froze for a few seconds before telling him I wasn't sure. Mark looked toward table 4, and his voice dropped to a... He told me that 3 years ago, a woman named Rena used to come to the shop and always sat at that table. She was nearly 20 years younger than him. They grew close and eventually fell in love, but Mark had hidden the fact that he was married. Feeling guilty, he decided to break up with her, telling her the relationship was a mistake. Rena was devastated, and a few weeks later, she took her own life in her apartment. I believe Rena's spirit still comes back here and sits at table 4. That daily bowl of ramen is my way of asking for her forgiveness, Mark said. Mark's story gave me the chills. After he finished, he got up to get back to work. While I was sitting there reflecting on the story, an older man sitting at the next table leaned in close. He spoke very softly, just loud enough for me to hear. "He's lying." Before I could react, he continued, "He's afraid, but he's afraid of the wrong person." I was startled. The old man claimed to be a psychic. He stared intensely at the empty table and described what he saw. That is not a 30-year-old woman sitting there. It is the ghost of a young girl in a high school uniform. She has long black hair and a massive wound on her forehead from a violent impact. There is dried blood matted on her shirt, and she isn't looking at the ramen. She is staring at Mark with pure, absolute rage, as if she wants to tear him apart right now. I couldn't see a thing, but the old man's description made the hair on my neck stand up. I looked at table 4, but there was only a bowl of ramen with a faint trail of steam rising from it. After the old man left, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. Finally, I couldn't help myself. I went to Mark and repeated the description of the high school girl and the wound on her forehead. Immediately, Mark dropped the glass in his hand. His face turned ghost white. He stammered that he wasn't feeling well and hurriedly announced he was closing the shop early. On my walk home, my mind was haunted by the image of the girl in the school uniform. As I passed a utility pole on a dark stretch of road, I noticed a faded "Witness Wanted" sign taped over some old posters. It was for a hit-and-run accident that happened exactly 1 year ago. The victim was a high school girl. Looking at the faded photo of the victim, I remembered the spirit the old man had described. A terrifying theory began to form in my head, but I shook it off, telling myself I was overthinking. The next night, I went back to the ramen shop, but to my surprise, it wasn't open. A "temporarily closed" sign was taped to the glass door. Daniel was standing quietly out front. I asked him what happened. Daniel replied shortly that Mark had been arrested by the police in connection with a hit-and-run from a year ago. I looked at Daniel and blurted out, "Was it that high school girl?" Daniel lightly touched the bracelet on his wrist and nodded. "He had to pay for taking my sister's life," Daniel said, his voice thick with resentment. I stood there, completely stunned by the whole situation. It turned out the psychic from the night before was just an acquaintance of Daniel's, acting out a role to make the story believable. When I accidentally repeated the old man's words to Mark, it triggered his deepest fears. In a state of panic, Mark confessed everything: how he had been drinking, driving in the dark, and had struck and killed a high school girl before fleeing the scene. Daniel had recorded the entire confession. Everything clicked together in my head like a completed puzzle, but the reality felt heavier than I imagined. As it turned out, that steaming bowl of ramen at table 4 every day wasn't an offering for a lost love. It was a cold, calculated psychological trap set for a cowardly killer.
My name is Mike, and I am 30 years old. At the end of 2024, I took a job working the morning shift at a Shell gas station on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio. I had to be at work by 6 a.m. every day, so I got used to waking up early, usually before 5. I had just moved into a small unit in a budget apartment complex on East 55th Street. It was a rundown building with peeling paint and walls so thin you could hear your neighbors sighing through the drywall. My apartment was on the 2nd floor. My bedroom window looked straight down at the playground below. It was an old, depressing place with rusty swings and cracked seesaws where children rarely played. About a month after I moved in, I started noticing a strange routine. Every morning between 4 and 4:30 a.m., dry, heavy thuds would come from my ceiling, which was the floor of apartment 3B on the 3rd floor. Thump. Thump. Sometimes it sounded like something heavy was being slammed against the wall, followed by small vibrations that traveled down into my bed frame. At first, I just shrugged it off. I figured it was just the sounds of a heavy drinker or a couple that liked to argue. But the truly weird part was what happened immediately afterward. At exactly 5 a.m., a middle-aged man would appear in the playground. He always wore a thin white tank top, despite the bone-chilling Ohio winter. He would perform rhythmic aerobic exercises all by himself. Sometimes, he would even have a wide, beaming smile on his face, looking like he was having the time of his life. The routine was as steady as a clock. At 4:15, I'd hear the thumping on the ceiling. And at 5, the guy in the tank top would be in the yard exercising with a look of pure excitement. One morning, I felt genuinely uneasy. It was freezing cold and thick with fog. I looked down and saw the man wasn't exercising. He was just standing frozen in the middle of the playground, eyes wide and staring into nothing, his mouth moving as if he were praying or cursing. One afternoon, I ran into Mrs. Sam, a longtime neighbor who lived across the hall from me. I asked her about the family upstairs. "Do you know the people in 3B?" I asked as she struggled with her grocery bags. Mrs. Sam froze, and the look in her eyes changed instantly. "Don't worry about that. Getting involved only brings trouble," she said. "I'm just curious. Is there something wrong with them?" Mrs. Sam shook her head and added, "Young man, around here, people learn not to care too much about what's going on around them. Trust me." My curiosity about the family in 3B and the man in the playground was finally answered at the end of February 2025. That morning, I woke up, but I didn't hear the familiar thump on the ceiling. As I was getting ready to leave for work, red and blue lights from ambulances and police cars surrounded the apartment entrance. A crowd was gathered in the 3rd floor hallway. As I pushed through, paramedics were wheeling a stretcher out of apartment 3B. A body lay on it, covered from head to toe with a white sheet. Walking beside the stretcher was a man sobbing hysterically. I was shocked to realize it was the same man who always exercised in the playground. His face was beet red, tears were streaming down his cheeks, and he was clutching the stretcher, trying to pull it back. He cried out, his voice breaking. "Sarah, don't leave me!" I stood there, stunned. So he lived on the third floor, right above me. His name was Robbie, and the woman on the stretcher was his wife. The police began to tape off the crime scene. They took statements from Mrs. Sam and others, and the tension in the air was suffocating. The incident in Robbie's family had the whole building buzzing. I still saw Robbie exercising after that day, but the energy and the joyful smiles were gone. He was quieter. More importantly, the noises from his apartment had stopped completely. But the truth has a way of revealing its cruelty. 2 days later, the police returned to arrest Robbie. As they handcuffed him, he sobbed, saying he didn't mean it and that it was just an accident. Through the whispers of neighbors and the investigation reports, I finally realized with horror what I had been witnessing all along. Robbie was a monster. He had a sick, twisted habit. Every early morning, he would demand intimacy from his wife. If Sarah refused because she was tired or sick, Robbie would fly into a rage. Those thumping sounds I heard every morning weren't the sounds of furniture moving. They were the sounds of Sarah's body being thrown against the walls, her head hitting the floor, or lamps being smashed to pieces. And the most disgusting part was the reason he went to the playground to exercise. After every brutal beating, Robbie felt his stress had been completely flushed away. He went to the playground to change his mood, to bask in the satisfaction of a man who had just asserted absolute power through violence. That radiant smile I saw through my window was the high he felt after torturing a poor soul. On the morning Sarah died, the injuries from years of abuse had finally caused her body to give out. A hard shove from Robbie caused her to hit her head on the edge of a table. This time, she didn't wake up to see her husband go down to the playground for his morning workout. Robbie was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to life in prison. Apartment 3B is empty now, but its silence is even more terrifying than the noises used to be. I am haunted by the fact that I unknowingly watched the routine of a crime take place every single day. I lived right next door to hell and thought it was just normal life. Now, every time I look out at the playground, I remember Robbie and his wide, creepy smile. Everything is covered in a layer of quiet gloom. The noises from upstairs are gone, but in my head, they still ring out as a reminder of the evil that lived silently above me.
My name is Alicia. I'm 20 years old and currently a third-year communications student in Oklahoma. The road I took to get here was far from normal. 5 years ago, I witnessed hell inside my own home, and the person who created that hell was my father. Things weren't always bad. I still remember the days before my dad joined the military. He used to be warm and kind, but after he returned from Afghanistan in 2016, he was a completely different man. The change was slow, but terrifying. It started with small bursts of anger and screaming for no reason. Then, he started installing cameras everywhere. In the living room, the kitchen, the hallways, and even the bedrooms. Every move we made, and every word we said, was recorded. My mom tried to endure it. She thought it was just PTSD from the war, and believed things would go back to the way they were. But the real nightmare began in 2020. It started over something as small as a window curtain. My mom closed the curtain because the afternoon sun was too bright. My dad suddenly snapped. He screamed that she was trying to hide something and accused her of having an affair. After that day, things got worse than I could have ever imagined. His anger wasn't just words anymore. He took it out on my mom every single day, and the violence became more severe. He used guns, belts, and once even a metal flagpole. And he forced my two siblings and me to stand there and watch.
I was 15, my brother was 12, and my little sister was only 7. We huddled in the corner of the room, shaking with fear and trying not to cry out loud. My brother was so scared, he closed his eyes and covered his ears. But my dad wouldn't let him. He forced him to look. We were too young to understand much, but we knew that fear would stay with us forever. After every outburst, the house would fall into a deadly silence. My father, with a terrifyingly calm face, would order me to clean up the battlefield. I had to pick up broken glass from the floor and wipe away dried blood. Then, he made me bathe my mother. I remember exactly how my hands shook as I washed my mother, who no longer had the strength to move. She looked at me and cried. Her lips moved, but no words came out. I knew she wanted to say something, but she couldn't. I bathed her while biting my lip as hard as I could to keep from sobbing. Those 48 hours felt like an endless nightmare. Finally, my mom couldn't take it anymore. Her body was too broken from the constant injuries. She passed away, right there in the house, in front of our eyes. When she died, my father showed no regret. He immediately started thinking of ways to hide it. He called us together and forced us to memorize a lie, that she had an accident, an overdose, or anything that sounded believable. He told us that when we called 911, we had to say exactly what he told us. He said if anyone told the truth, he wouldn't let them go. But he forgot one thing. The very cameras he installed to control us became the clearest evidence against him. Every single act of violence had been recorded, second by second. When the police arrived after the death report, they noticed something was wrong immediately. We were acting terrified, avoiding eye contact, and our stories didn't match the scene. The police asked more questions and watched our reactions closely. It didn't take long for them to find the camera system. When the first video was played, they didn't need any more statements. The evidence was undeniable. My father was arrested right away, but the legal journey wasn't easy. The case lasted 5 years with a long string of trials, hearings, and depositions. I had to tell that horrific story over and over again. But I kept going for my mother, thinking about the pain she had to endure. There were nights I couldn't sleep, because as soon as I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's final moments. Finally, in October 2025, it all came to an end. My father pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. The judge sentenced him to 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The case is over, but the trauma stays with my siblings and me. However, our lives have to go on, even if it isn't easy. Now I am majoring in communications. I'm doing it not just because I love it, but because it was the dream my mother had for me. I still think about her often, especially when I'm alone. There are memories I want to forget, but can't. And honestly, I don't want to forget. Even though it's in the past, the pain is still there. It doesn't suffocate me like it used to, but it's a part of who I am. I'm learning to live with it. I never thought I would get through this, but the 3 of us grew up anyway. I don't hate my father. Instead of holding on to bitterness, I choose to remember the time when he was actually a good dad. Even though my story started with pain, I don't want it to end there. I hope that one day, when I tell this story, I won't see myself as a victim anymore. I want to be proof of survival and courage. If my story can help someone else walk out of their own darkness, then everything I went through wasn't for nothing. The true story. This narrative is inspired by the real-life case of Alicia Brown. At 15, she witnessed a family tragedy when her father, Joshua Brown, became violent after returning from Afghanistan. In 2020, fueled by irrational jealousy, he tortured his wife for 48 hours and forced his children, including Alicia, to clean the scene. After the victim died, he tried to cover up the crime, but was caught because of the camera system he installed to monitor the family. In 2025, Joshua pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and received 4 life sentences. Alicia is currently a communication student, living out her mother's dreams. My name is Ryan, and I am 23 years old. 5 years ago, my best friend from high school, Jake, and I decided to celebrate our 18th birthdays with the trip of a lifetime. We wanted to do something wild that none of our other friends would ever think of. We chose Siberia, the land of ice, to test our grit. Jake joked that if we could survive the Siberian cold, we could handle anything life threw at us. It took us almost 2 days of travel just to reach Yakutsk, but we were young and full of energy. Once we arrived, we rented an old Toyota from a local guy. He spoke broken English and tried his best to explain something about the weather and the road conditions. We just nodded, took the keys, and headed out, buzzing with excitement. For the first few days, we explored the city. The cold there was like nothing I had ever felt. It was haunting. Even though we grew up in Minnesota and were used to snowy winters, the freezing temperatures in Yakutsk completely overwhelmed us. On the 5th day, we planned a longer trip toward Oymyakon, which is known as the coldest village on Earth. Instead of taking the Kolyma Highway, which was the safe, established route, we put our absolute trust in Google Maps. It showed a shortcut through the Tomtor region. On the screen, it looked like a perfect straight line that would cut our travel time nearly in half. Without thinking twice, we turned onto that road. We had no idea that the road had been abandoned since 1970. At first, things seemed okay. The scenery was beautiful, just endless white snow and a ghostly, untouched wilderness. We had a blast taking photos and filming videos, but as we drove deeper, the road began to fall apart. The car started to shake and the engine made a high-pitched, straining sound. Then, disaster struck without warning. We didn't see a large, frozen branch sticking out in the middle of the road. It kicked up hard as we drove over it. There was a loud bang, and the car jolted violently. Jake gripped the steering wheel to keep us on the path. When the car finally skidded to a stop, we heard a terrifying hissing sound. We jumped out and saw that the branch had pierced right through the radiator. The cooling system was destroyed and fluid was spraying everywhere. A few seconds later, the engine died completely. The silence that followed was terrifying. The biting cold and the howling wind immediately began to swallow the sound of our panicked breathing. We scrambled back inside the car. Jake tried to turn the key over and over, but the engine just clicked and stayed dead. I pulled out my phone, but there was zero signal. We looked at each other, and for the first time, real panic started to set in. The temperature outside was minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was dropping fast as the sun went down. We hadn't packed any heavy-duty survival gear or professional Arctic clothing. We had been so careless and stupid. We have to stay warm. "Is there anything we can burn?" Jake asked, his voice already starting to crack from the cold. We searched the car. We found a few paper maps, a box of matches, and a spare tire. We dragged the tire outside and lit it on fire. We sat as close to the flames as possible, holding our hands out and shivering, praying that someone, anyone, would drive by. That first night, we tried to stay optimistic. The next day, after the spare tire burned out. We tried to take the other tires off the car to burn them too, but our hands were already freezing. Our fingers were so numb and stiff that we couldn't even hold the lug wrench. Eventually, all our efforts became useless. We crawled back into the car and hugged each other tight to share body heat. Time felt like it was stretching on forever. We prayed and talked about our plans back home in the States, starting college, the girls we liked, and watching football in the fall. We talked about anything just to keep ourselves from falling into a permanent sleep. By the third day, Jake couldn't hold on anymore. His responses became shorter and further apart. His voice got weaker until it was just a tiny, faint moan. "Ryan, I'm so sleepy," he whispered. I screamed at him and slapped his face. "Don't sleep, Jake, look at me." By the fourth day, I realized Jake's body had stopped shivering. He lay perfectly still beside me. His skin was turning a pale, stony blue. I shook his shoulders as hard as I could, but there was no reaction. I screamed his name and begged him to stay with me, but it was no use. I had to watch my best friend freeze to death right in front of me, and I couldn't do a single thing to stop it. The cold eventually began to numb my emotions along with my body. Starting on the fifth day, I began to drift into the same state Jake had. I could feel it happening. My body didn't feel cold anymore. Instead, I felt a strange, almost pleasant numbness. I thought about my parents and how much pain they would be in when they got the news. I thought about Jake and figured at least we would be together. I leaned against Jake's cold body and finally drifted off. Just as I had accepted that I was going to die, a miracle happened. A local man happened to be traveling down that abandoned road and spotted our car. He later told me that he had to use a shovel to smash the window. Inside, he found Jake, who was frozen solid, and me, barely breathing. I was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. I had severe hypothermia and ended up losing 5 toes and 3 fingers to gangrene caused by frostbite. After I recovered, I returned to America with a broken soul, carrying the weight of losing my best friend. I find it hard to see Jake's family because of the guilt. They don't blame me, but I blame myself. If only I hadn't taken that damn shortcut. If only we hadn't been so arrogant. I'm still alive, but I paid a massive price for a reckless decision I made when I was 18. Every time winter comes around, I remember Jake and that haunting, deadly cold of Yakutsk. Inspired by a true story, 2 18-year-old Russian men, Sergei Ustinov and Vladislav Istomin, met with disaster while traveling from Yakutsk to Magadan via a shortcut suggested by Google Maps, instead of the longer, safer route recommended by Yandex Maps. They were unaware that the road through Tomtor had been abandoned since 1970. Their car became stranded in the freezing wilderness at minus 50 degrees Celsius. They lost phone signal, were unable to communicate, and were forced to burn their tires to keep warm. Nearly a week later, they were discovered. Sergei had frozen to death, while Vladislav miraculously survived and recounted the tragedy to the police. My name is Dylan. The story I'm about to tell happened 14 years ago, when I was a reckless 16-year-old, fueled by puberty-driven heat and untamed psychological struggles. Grade 10 at my high school was a survival arena. It was a year thick with drama, judgmental stares, and sharp tongues. For a kid newly diagnosed with epilepsy and autism like me, school was a brutal landscape. I learned to bite back with the harshest words, just to protect myself. I promised I wouldn't let anyone step on me ever again. But even my personal rebellion couldn't match the heavy atmosphere of hatred within that school of 600 students. Our head of year, Mr. Stevenson, aka Stevo, once lost total control in the main hall, screaming about our insolence. It was a clear sign that this pressure cooker was about to blow. That day started like any other boring one. I sat in the corner, isolated from the cliques. Mr. Innes's class was halfway through when the PA system crackled to life. Ding, dang, dong. The principal's voice came on, eerily flat and calm. He announced a code black. I glanced at the code chart taped next to the whiteboard. Code black meant lockdown. Everyone knew what that meant. An intruder, a gunman, or a lethal threat was on the premises. Mr. Innes acted like a machine. He locked the door, taped paper over the door window, and pulled the blinds. Light was deleted. The classroom plunged into total darkness. The silence hit so fast, it made my ears ache. You know that kind of silence? The kind where, if a needle dropped, it would sound like a bomb. I sat with my back against the wall, my eyes adjusting to the dark as I watched everyone's expressions. The group of 7 loudmouthed boys sat dead still. The 4 girls at the front, the ones who usually cackled like hyenas, were huddled like frightened mice. Fear has a smell, and in that moment, the room reeked of cold sweat. Questions raced through my mind. Where is he? Does he have a gun? Will this thin door hold? 20 minutes passed in that thick darkness. I wasn't scared. A twisted part of me felt a surge of adrenaline. I was ready to fight if a shadow stepped through that door. But then, the PA system crackled again. All clear. It turned out a hero in my own grade had pulled a knife on the principal right in his office. He was expelled immediately, leaving us with a horror story to tell at lunch. But the madness of grade 10 wasn't finished. A month before graduation, as we were counting down the days to escape that hellhole, the speaker spoke again. Code Gray. This time we weren't hiding in the dark. We were just locked in the hall. There was a suspicious stranger wandering the grounds. I bolted to the front hall window, claiming the best vantage point. Outside, 2 security guards were confronting a stranger. The argument was heated. I was screaming in my head, "Fight! Do something dramatic!" The whole school was watching a live action movie. But then, the person just walked away. A teacher said it was just someone having a bad day. I pouted in disappointment, thinking it was a lame false alarm. I was wrong. A year later, when I was 17 and in college, I started to grow up. I owed a lot of that to a teaching assistant named Annie, the only person who could tame the wild animal in me without using force. One afternoon on the bus home, a girl stepped on. We recognized each other instantly. She had been in my classes since 7th grade, but transferred right after that year. We sat together, reminiscing about the old days. When I mentioned the Code Gray incident as a funny memory, she went quiet for a second, then smiled. "Dylan, you know what? I was the one who caused that Code Gray." I froze. She wouldn't say exactly why she went back to the old school to cause that chaos, but the truth made me burst out laughing. It turns out that in that school I called trash, lost souls were always bumping into each other in the strangest ways. Those 2 terrifying lockdowns ended up being the most ridiculous pieces of my journey into adulthood. Thank you, Annie, for holding on to me before I could cause a code black of my own. This story may not be scary in the sense other ones are, but at the time it was very unsettling. It took place in Glasgow in 2011. I went to a college outside the city center, and this story involves a couple of people on my course, which was television, broadcasting, production. Louise was a very well-liked student on the course. She was very friendly, very bubbly, and very pretty. She had bright dyed red hair and very pale skin. She looked a little like Hayley Williams from Paramore. There was a couple of guys on the course who were friends with her but were obviously keen on being more than friends with her. This was a time before I was aware of the incel community, and I was naive about how some young men view women. These guys made sexist comments and would make inappropriate jokes about women. These two guys, Mike and James, were obsessed with filmmaking and the internet. They had allegedly both made inappropriate comments to Louise, and although she didn't appreciate them, she appeared to not let it bother her. I hadn't heard any of these comments myself, but in hindsight, I wish I'd stepped in. I did once ask her if she'd like me to have a word, but she said no and appeared very confident that she'd handle it if things went too far. She was sure they were just joking and were immature. As the months passed by on the course, things seemed fine, and I forgot about the things Louise had highlighted about James and Mike. Towards the end of the course, we were tasked with making 2 minute short films, and our course lecturer divided us all into teams of 3. You can probably guess who Louise ended up with in her team. My short film was a very poorly made science fiction comedy thing, which wasn't remotely funny. Louise's film was due to be a crime thriller type thing, which sounded really good, but it didn't really work out like this. So the story goes, Louise, Mike, and James scripted out their short film and seemed happy with their script when it came to filming. I should say that we were allowed to use actors, or we could act in the films ourselves. Louise didn't really want to act in her film, however she was convinced to do it by James and Mike. They filmed their short in James's house, and Louise was to play the victim of a home invasion. His parents were away on holiday, so they'd have the house to themselves. When it came to filming, Louise was to sit in a chair and to be taped to it. James and Mike duct taped her wrists and arms to the armrests of the chair, and then they taped her ankles together. Record was then pressed on the camera. She was feeling a little anxious at this point, as there was something very off about their demeanor, and Louise wished she'd refused to be the actor for this scene. She was about to suggest they pause, but before she could get the words out, she felt duct tape quickly being wrapped around her mouth. This took her by surprise, as this was not in the script. Her nostrils were flaring, and she tried talking, but her mouth was heavily taped, so this was not possible. She tried to say, "What the fuck are you guys doing?" But no words made it through the tape. Louise said she was sure she was having a nightmare at this point, and closed her eyes, hoping to wake up, however. When she opened her eyes, she was devastated to realize she was bound and gagged in James's house for real. She caught her reflection in a nearby mirror and said her cheeks were bulging over the shiny silver duct tape, and her hair was in agony as the tape was applied very tightly to it. The camera had been turned on, and James and Mike were now just staring at Louise behind the camera. She was breathing very loudly through her nose and was terrified. They finally said after many minutes, "We know this isn't part of your script, but we thought we'd improv." Louise was terrified and confused. "We know you weren't keen to act, so we added this to get that reaction from you. It looks great." Louise was shocked that this was part of some weird improvised segment that these two creeps had added purely to get a genuine reaction from her. These were short films for a film course that nobody would watch. They weren't supposed to be Oscar-nominated shorts, so the fact these two took it this far was disturbing. They began to remove the gag from Louise's mouth, and she grunted and mumbled as her hair was being pulled out with the removal of the tape. As soon as the final piece of tape was removed from her mouth, she began screaming at them and rightly berated them for this. They apparently were shocked and stunned by her reaction. Louise demanded they cut her arms and feet free, and then stormed out of James's house. Our course lecturer spoke to both of them, and both were only given a warning about this. We couldn't believe it. If anything, they should have been kicked off the course at the very least. To make things more infuriating, both of these creeps continue to work in the TV industry to some degree. Louise does too, and she has been very successful. I have also been grateful to have had a successful career in television here in the UK for the last decade or so. But the fact these two continue to work in the industry, despite their views and behavior, leaves a bad taste in the mouth. The television and film industries obviously have a very bad record for having unsavory people in front of and behind the camera. So in some ways, I'm not surprised that these two are still present in the industry, but I do wonder if they have done anything else such as this. I hope they have matured and moved past their incel stage, but it irks me that Louise didn't really get any form of justice for this incident.
Thank you for watching until the end. As mentioned earlier, our goal of reaching 50,000 subscribers in 2026 is still ongoing. If you enjoy these stories, please give us a hand and support us.